over too much for the people online who've not been able to chime in. All that they potentially missed was the saying in Latin that I, again, am not going to try to say in Latin about how ignorance of the law is not an excuse from the liability that you incur by breaking the law. So the important part about this is that there are many things in our lives where we don't necessarily recognize them as laws, but they govern our behavior nonetheless. And so an example of this is, of rules that are out there are things like policies that we agree to when we engage in, various activities with entities. And so, of course, policies that people are maybe, very familiar with here as computer scientists would be, for example, privacy policies. And so this is a quick screenshot from Meta, but there are many of these things out there. I'm sure everyone here does the same thing I do, which is scroll through terms of service and all these things that pop up just so I can get the thing that I need to get done. Although I do read through them from time to time, and you can find little tidbits in there on how to find yourself to be exempt from them. I do that when, for fun. In any case, the question we have here when we're engaging with these policies is how do people actually, understand them? And so one thing to start thinking about is what the possible outcomes are and how are they determined. And so initially they're determined by things like code, so what the software actually affords, so what is actually possible through the execution of software. And then what the user behavior is, so how do users interact with code. And so this idea of what's possible is something that we engage with every day when we're playing around with systems. But we're all here at ProLaLa' right now. We've seen a lot of discussion about the idea of what is permissible instead. And so the way that we reason about what's permissible is we need to start encoding things like what the legal statutes are and what the firm's own policies are encoding. Because these two things interact with each other in certain ways, and sometimes the firm's own policies are going to be more expansive than the law or are going to have things that are not currently well defined within the law. So knowing this, we've seen a lot of discussion about these sorts of things today. There is an idea that has sort of been alluded to throughout the day, and a big problem here, which is that these kinds of things, legal reasoning, are very difficult for people to understand. Not even legal reasoning, right? Because you hire lawyers, and no one who's working on this team is a lawyer. But just in general, user policy, privacy policies that we give everyday people to sign, we know to be very difficult for people to understand, for end users to understand. Even people who are experts have difficulty understanding these things on first pass. And so there's been prior work that has established that. That's what's cited here. And so this is something to keep in mind when we think about various systems that are actually encoding behavior and outcomes. So a possible solution here, that should be unsurprising from the title of the work, is to use what's called narrative. And so it's pretty straightforward. You can see here from this image that when we say narrative, what we're really talking about are stories. And so we can think about narrative as giving us a kind of explanation for how things work. So rather than giving people a rule set that they have to interpret and forward simulate, we're instead going to give them a set of stories that are relevant to them. And so this dovetails nicely with the last talk about what it means to actually comprehend a system. So I'm going to pivot briefly from the previous discussion about HIPAA, wow, I just gave away the game, about privacy policies on websites like Meta. And instead, we're going to actually talk about HIPAA for a moment. So this is a law that is particular to the US, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. And so it's something that describes how your data can be transmitted. And so you may be wondering, okay, this is an interesting setup for privacy policies. Why are we pivoting to HIPAA at this point? So the first reason is that there's a long history of people studying HIPAA. And so this is great. It's well established in the field. It's well understood. We're not turning our attention to something that's perhaps underspecified. It also has some prior formalization. So because there are very serious consequences to errors in reasoning about the application of this law, it's very important for people who study it to have spent time actually working with experts. And because of that, because of these prior formalizations, it means that there are actually resources for non-experts. So it's a nice entry point if you don't actually have a background in law to start to understand what some of the legal obligations are regarding this particular law. And so if we can build a system that can work with HIPAA, the idea is that we could eventually use some of those techniques and apply them to other contexts. So what narrative gives us is a possible solution to the explanation problem. And so the idea here is that a narrative ends up having a sequence of events that are in some way related. And so you could have a person who asks about a particular scenario or particular outcome of interest, and the narrative generator will give us a sequence of events that could cause that particular outcome. And so the underlying mechanism that, and technology that we're using to enable the system is this idea of narrative generation and policy formalization. And we're using ASP in order to produce these artifacts. So this is a summary of the general approach. And the key idea here is to use these narratives that actually describe entities taking actions. So these are two really important points here because we now have a system where we're talking about components that are slightly different from perhaps the way we might traditionally think about like propositional reasoning. So again, to be very clear about what we mean by narrative, is that a narrative is a sequence of events, right? And so it has to be something that is temporally related, and those events should have some sort of causal relationship with each other. So as a disclaimer, and they should be related in a way that an end user would understand to be a story. So as a slight disclaimer, if you have questions about this, this is a very well understood subfield of AI. Chris has like amazing expertise in this. It is the person to ask questions about. I am only just learning about this right now. My background includes things like statistical causal reasoning, which is a bit different, and some statistical explanation. Happy to chat with people about how these are connected to each other. But in terms of the purely symbolic reasoning, if you have questions about this, please put them in the chat because I can guess, but Chris is the expert on this. So in any case, this is very cool. This kind of work describes how actors behave in an environment and how they might change the environment and how information is propagated. And so what we've done, in particular Chinmaya really has done, is to encode the entities that are described in HIPAA according to a hierarchy. And one of the nuances of this work is that you can't necessarily have a strict, what's the word I'm looking for, like disjoint union of roles, for example. And so there are cases where either contextually or like mostly contextually, there are actors that can take on various roles depending upon the situation, what the situation entails. And so this is something where being able to reason in a compositional way is really critically important for this work. And so these entities end up being encoded in an ASP system, and then there are actions that actors can take, and this is an example of the encoding of the policy, the HIPAA policy, in ASP. And so this work actually uses narrative infrastructure that Chinmaya and Chris have worked on previously. This is an AAA's aid paper from 2020. And it describes a reusable system for giving information about narratives, for providing narratives. So one of the problems is that a lot of narrative planners have to be re-implemented every time you use them in a different context. And so some of this work is getting towards having sort of reusable modules in this space. And so a key idea of this work is encoding actors' goals and encoding the narrative system in a way that enables both local and modular reasoning. And this has several effects, but one of them is it can make queries easier for end users to express. So we have this general problem where if you want to know if something can happen, you need to have this really potentially have a sophisticated understanding of the system in order to express the query that you want explained. But if you can describe the way actors are going to interact with the system in terms of their goals, which may conflict with your goals, you can now start to describe the set of constraints that you're working in as modular on the modular, like sort of indexed on actors' intention. And so what this allows us to do then is to potentially lower the barrier for end users to express their, don't go to sleep, allows end users to express their queries in a way that potentially would be much more usable than having to express the full propositional system. So some future work that is currently in progress, I'd love to chat with people about, this is a lot of like what Chinmaya's been working on, have to do with things like updating the policies as we encode them so that they're also modular. So in addition to the fact that we need to understand how a system actually works, the code, how it's executing an environment, and how the law works, if you have a privacy policy that is both, needs to comport with the law or be consistent with the law, and describe the way that the code works, if you want to update it in light to changes of the code, we need to be able to do that in a way that doesn't require whole-scale rewriting of the system. We would also like to see these reusable, more reusable modules to express new laws or ensure future compliance. And so there's been some discussion here, and there's some very cool stuff going on that people have posted about or have talked about today regarding some higher level systems where people could potentially reuse the concepts and relations that are being encoded in some of these ASP systems. And then finally, there's some work that Chinmaya has been doing on allowing policy authors to be able to actually test scenarios against the system that they have. And so if you, for example, see reported some sort of privacy violation that's in the news, you could encode it in your system and use that in order to figure out whether or not that violation is possible in your system. And so in summary, this particular narrative generation approach allows us to actually have verifiable, modular, explorable, and interpretable privacy policies that end users could use and policy authors can update. So that is a high-level description.
Thank you very much, Emma. Do we have questions in the room? So if I've understood correctly, technical questions should be addressed in the chat because Chris is here to answer them, but you may have other non-technical questions. Yeah, go ahead.